Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and I am delighted to have back our very dear friend, Sarah Kay Bierle. Sarah, how are you tonight?
I'm doing pretty well, thanks, Chris.
Awesome. And I'm sure that there are many ECW fans who are like, Sarah's back, Sarah's back. So this will be a chance for rejoicing for many folks. And we're talking about your new book about decisions at Chancellorsville, part of the Command Decisions series from the University of Tennessee Press. Congratulations on another book.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on the podcast. Thank you, Chris, personally, for introducing me to the editors of the series. You have had a hand in this one, so it's exciting to get to chat about it with you.
So tell me a little bit about how this came about, because the Command Decisions series looks at different battles, and rather than just a straight narrative, they kind of like break it down into those crucial, critical battles. How did you get involved, and why did you decide to take the project on?
Oh, that's a great question. And Chancellorsville is a battlefield that I had read about as a child and convinced my parents when we were touring the East Coast. For those who might not know, I grew up on the West Coast in California. And so we came and were touring around Virginia when I was about 14. And I convinced my parents that we had to go to the Central Virginia battlefields because we could visit 4 Civil War battlefields in one day: Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, and Spotsylvania. And at the time, the Stonewall Jackson Shrine, now named the Stonewall Jackson Death Site. So we actually did skip Spotsylvania, but wanted to
You,
come,
you wouldn't
wanted
be
to
the you
see.
wouldn't be the first person, by the way. Yeah, but like four battlefields is a lot in one day, though. It's
Right. And Chancellorsville, it is memorably in my mind. It was this rainy day, and being there at the battlefield, and I was hyper fixated on Stonewall Jackson and not really getting all the rest of the stories. Fast forward a few years, quite a few years, and I've moved to Central Virginia. It's COVID years. I spent lots of time outside hiking. Chancellorsville became one of the places that I would just go and walk and walk and walk and reading official records, primary sources, piecing together stories. It kind of was this full circle moment of realizing there is so much more to the Chancellorsville story than just Stonewall Jackson. And it was about that time, kind of coming on the heels of lots of months of walking around Chancellorsville, that you, Chris, reached out and was you were wondering if I might be interested in the Decisions at Chancellorsville project. I had lots of questions, of course, and the more I thought about it and started, well, what could these decision points be? I got really excited about the project. The editors that I worked with were wonderful. They realized I was in the middle of some job changes and were very patient with me. So I do want to give many thanks to Matt and Larry for working with me as I was taking on a writing project that was in many ways much larger than others I had done before.
And just kind of from my perspective, you had written the Newmarket book, you had most of the Pelham book done at that point, and so I felt like you were ready for something a little meatier, a little more substantial, a little more military, micro-tactical,
Yeah.
and so I thought like this would, I think, be a good kind of next step for you. What was it like to make that transition into something that was a bit more nuts and boltsy on a military level?
I appreciated it in so many ways. I really enjoy the deep dive of looking at military history and tactics and how decisions play out. And for me, working on decisions at Chancellorsville was a way to get more comfortable with an academic style of writing, but I still wanted it to be accessible. I wanted it to be very readable. So, kind of finding my voice in that took a little bit of time. I referred to your book, Decisions at Fredericksburg, in the same series, Chris, quite a bit to see what you had done, but I knew I didn't want to copy your style. I needed to find something that was my own voice, while, of course, adhering to a very strict pattern that is required for exploring these decisions in the framework of the series as it's presented.
So the framework of that series really kind of focuses on what are the critical decisions that affected the outcome of the battle? As you know, and there are many sorts of types of decisions that happen on the high command level, on the, the division, brigade, regimental, individual soldier level, all sorts of decisions. But these are critical decisions. Tell me how you approached that idea.
Right. So this is where I kept getting sent back to the drawing board. Like the editors would be like, "Well, that's a decision, but it's not a critical decision." And what how they define critical decision in this series is something that is the point of no return. The moment that everything is going to hinge on going forward. If you change something in this critical moment, it's not going to look the same. And so we can play that out, and we're going to play it out in the military sense, in the tactical sense, in the strategic sense. But there would be decisions I'd come up with, and they're like, well, it doesn't rise to the level of critical. And really having to put together almost a case in the very early stages of the project, explaining how this decision is critical and how it's one of those hinge moments. And one of the things that I wanted to consider in the process was who's making the critical decisions. And most of the critical decisions in the book are coming from Robert E. Lee, commander of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, and General Joseph Hooker, commander of the Union Army of the Potomac. There are a few in there that are kind of wild cards, and one that I just felt really passionate that it needed to be part of the project is part of the fighting that happens to the east. While there's the battle happening at the Chancellorsville crossroads, there's other fighting happening in this period, in this campaign.
That
And
forgotten front of
the
Chancellorsville,
forgotten
correct?
front. And at the risk of a slight tangent, I might have read and cited a certain book by you and Mr. Chris White. So but there's that moment where Union troops have been trying to attack the sunken road, attack Marie's Heights, and then the road that's leading to the west. So Union troops in this moment. And from what we see in the primary sources and the reports and the battle study, it's this moment where the decision comes from the ranks itself. The officers on the ground with the men, in some ways, the men themselves. As far as we know, there's not a big order that comes in like, now's the moment. They've realized there's been this pause, this truce that'll be highly debated by Confederates in the weeks, months, and years after the battle. We talk about that. That's one of the critical decisions in that moment from the other side. But the surge of Union troops, like now's the time. If we wait for orders, if we wait to check in and see if this might be the right thing to do, we could miss the opportunity. So that's one decision that I stole it away from headquarters because it doesn't happen at headquarters. And, just to look at the words of the men and officers making that charge, which is going to sweep up the infamous Marie's Heights from the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862. Now, in May 1863, we have Union troops up on that high ground. Confederates are in retreat or being captured, and it's quite a moment for those units of the Army of the Potomac.
The spontaneity of that reminds me a lot of the Army of the Cumberland as it's attacking Missionary Ridge, and suddenly it's going to
Yes,
sweep up Missionary Ridge, and Grant and Thomas are like, "Who gave that order?" And it's like, "Oh, it wasn't me." It's because like the troops themselves realize like this is the next step that we have to take, and it's sort of
yes.
a very holistic kind of thing. So tell me, you made a bunch of uh, decisions, or you chose a bunch of decisions that didn't quite rise to the level of critical decisions. What might be an example of something that was not a critical decision as you were kind of wrestling with your final list?
Ooh, so one that I kept struggling with was what do you do with Stonewall Jackson?
Mm.
Confederate general. He's commanding the Second Corps. He makes the famous flank march and flank attack on the afternoon and evening of May 2nd, 1863. That attack has driven back Union troops for approximately a mile. And then, as the history goes, he goes out on a scouting mission as he's trying to return to Confederate lines. He's wounded by friendly fire. What do you do with that? I kept throwing all kinds of things at the dry erase board, seeing, like proposals, like, is this a critical decision? Because it is a bit of a critical moment, but what's the critical decision? Like, is it a decision to ride out into the dark? And I think I actually put that in one of the early drafts, and the editor's like, no, 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 that's not going to work. And as I re-looked at it, I realized it's a critical moment to the battle. Some might argue to Confederate Civil War history, but yeah, it's not a critical decision. So, what I ended up doing was sitting and thinking about it for a long time. And what is Jackson's motivator in that moment? It's not like he's out for a joyride scouting mission, there's a purpose to it. And he's wanting information. He's trying to figure out if there can be an attack that would push toward further north toward the Rappahannock River. Can he cut off Union troops from the ford or from some of the fords on the Rappahannock? And he's sent out scouts in different directions, and then he decides to make what becomes the fateful ride. So we ended up phrasing it, and I'm going to read it from the book because it's been through so many different phrases of it over the years, but we phrased it as Jackson plans to cut off the Federals from U.S. Ford, because that's the decision. It's not going to happen. And instead, we get to talk about what happens because he's trying to make that, he's trying to carry out that critical maneuver, which, armchair generaling here a little bit, is a very strange maneuver to want to make. Robert E. Lee has already divided his army multiple times. He divides his army in the winter, early winter months of 1863, sending most of the First Corps with James Longstreet into Southern Virginia. Part of that's because of a food supply situation. We talk a little bit, that's one of the critical decisions in the lead up to Chancellorsville, the battle in this book. But then when the battle itself is happening, Lee has divided his available troops. He's left Jubal early to watch Fredericksburg and Union troops that are have crossed the river and are sitting there. He's not quite sure. Lee is not quite sure what's going on there. The rest of the Confederate force has gone toward Chancellorsville, the crossroads sitting in the dense Virginia wilderness. Then Jackson, acting on information from General Stuart and cavalry scouts and locals providing information, proposes to take his corps on this flank march. Lee lets him divide the available force again. So we're doing this division. If we were cutting a pie, we're getting down to a narrow slice. And as Jackson has made the successful flank attack, he has not reconnected with Lee and the remaining divisions that are under Lee's command around the Chancellorsville crossroads, or threatening that position of the Union line. So with Jackson's idea to go north and threaten the fords, he's moving further away from Lee. This opens up would have opened up more of a gap between the divided Confederates. Could the Union troops have exploited that? It's possible they're in a position in the night where if they'd figured it out, it could have gone quite disastrously for the divided Confederates. So while cutting off retreat can lead to that decisive, shattering victory that Lee is looking for at Chancellorsville, Lee doesn't just want another victory on his banner, so to speak. He's trying to crush the Union Army of the Potomac to make it a force not to be reckoned with anymore in the Civil War. So Jackson is in some ways correct in looking at how do you cut a retreat route, but the army's so divided that it's a massive risk. They've already taken a big risk that's paid off with the flank attack, but how many more times do you keep taking risks of that size? So to me, it's really interesting that Jackson's trying to move in that direction, and it's going to unfold a whole chain of events, including when Jackson is wounded. Who's going to take command of his corps? And it's this moment because Robert Rhodes is not ready to be a corps commander, and A.P. Hill is down with a wound and doesn't want to take command. And it's this, who does Lee put in command? And that becomes another critical decision explored in the book.
Yeah, and so there become these series of dominoes because one decision often
Yes.
leads to the next that might not have even been on the radar screen, except that the sequence of events unfolds. I really like the way you explain like how you have to frame the decision in a way to kind of help your readers think of this sort of in that strategic critical sort of way, because one could say like Jackson decides to go on a reconnaissance, which is the kind of decision like commanders make all the time, right? And so like does it have that critical weight to it? Well, this particular instance, yes, it does turn out to have some, but I think kind of getting underneath the surface of that, like, well, why is he doing that reconnaissance? What's he trying to achieve? What puts him in that? And that, and that really opens things up to I think explore that moment in some, I think, pretty useful ways.
Right. And I think I know one of the things that I sort of grappled with is, do we have enough primary source evidence that we can point to that? Because Jackson doesn't write a battle report from Chancellorsville. So we are relying on somebody saying Jackson said, or Jackson sent off this other officer to try to see if he could find out information about the Fords. So this was one where I wanted to work with what we have available, not read into it too much, but it really does look like that's the underlying decision, the underlying motive in the moment there that we could raise. And I hope I did in a way that's interesting to read, bring that up to the critical decision level.
Yeah. I think about, like, Joe Revere pulls out his troops from the Union line because he says he's out of ammunition. That causes some problems, but the Federals are able to plug that gap. So, like, bad decision, worth exploring, but it doesn't really affect the outcome of the battle. Or
Exactly.
Hiram Berry deciding to carry orders across the road and then getting hit by enemy fire and dying. Like, bad decision
Nelson
doesn't
Miles,
change.
one of my
Yeah,
in,
yeah,
one of my
uh,
interesting figures from Chancellorsville.
so there are lots of ways that you could kind of talk about decisions that either impacted the people involved, or good or bad decisions here or there. But like that big, we're going to affect the sweep of history for these. Um, but you ended up finding quite a few for Chancellorsville. How many decisions? And I don't want you to give away the store, so don't tell us all
Right.
the decisions. But how many did you end up coming up with?
16.
16.
Originally there were 18 on the draft. Here we're lifting the veil a little bit. There were 18. And my editors had a couple questions on some of them, but they were like, see how it goes as you're writing. And as I was writing and working through the process of laying out the decisions, I came to the conclusion, nope, two of these don't make the cut. So that's one of the things with the series. Do the formal book proposal and want to pretty much see it as you're writing in wet cement at that point. Like, this is the list, but it's still wet cement. So if you're going, this is not a critical decision, it does not reach the level, you can revisit it. And I appreciated having that flexibility, both knowing the direction I needed to go with the writing, but also if we need to change something along the way, it will be okay to revisit.
Yeah. So what are the two that didn't make the cut? Do you mind telling us, or maybe you don't remember off the top of your head? I'm
I'm going
putting
to
you
be
on the
super
spot.
honest, Chris. I don't remember
Okay. Okay.
unless I go pull up my notes.
Yeah.
So
Well,
this
but
was a
it's
number of years ago now.
yeah, yeah. Well, and no, but it's a fair point because as I was working on decisions at Fredericksburg, one thing that I decided did not rise to that level was just how does Burnside reorganize his army and who does he put in charge? And I was like, that's an
Right.
important decision, but I didn't think that it rose quite to that critical decision. And some people have said like, oh, that's important. It was nice that my second readers were like, no, you're right, that's not, So kind of like as you sort of figure out like, well, what is and what isn't, you're trying things on for size. To me, I really kind of like the fluidity of that process for you as you try to kind of really decide, am I going to commit to this idea, or it's like maybe I'm committing to not do this idea.
Right. It's a critical decision as an author.
Yeah. Oh, look at that. Now, as you lay these decisions out, there's a particular format for the series. So you break you say what the decision is, and then you sort of, here's the background, here are the choices, here's the decision, here are the results. What was it like to kind of approach the battle from those sorts of blocks?
once I sort of got my head around it and how that format worked, I really enjoyed working with that because you've got the decision and you could almost focus on that piece of the battle as its own vignette. And it will connect to others. As you pointed out, oftentimes these are dominoes.
Yeah.
One thing happens, which is going to trigger another critical decision and another. Oh, and now it's your opponent's turn to have a critical decision. So, but you can kind of focus in. And I wrote a lot of the book very late at night, some of the latest nights I've ever stayed up for working on this.
And you're
Uh,
typically a late night writer. I mean, it's
yeah, at
not
the
like
time I
that.
was.
Yeah.
Maybe that's changed a little bit now. But I particularly remember working on decisions for May 3rd, 1863. So there's what's happening with Second Fredericksburg out to the east and Salem Church. And then there's what's happening at the Chancellorsville Crossroads. And we'd already decided we were just going to put the Chancellorsville Crossroads section or decisions in one chapter, and then we'd have another chapter to focus on Second Fredericksburg and Salem Church, so that we weren't, they are connected, but we felt it would be too confusing to go back and forth. So I remember particularly working on May 3rd, 1863, and it was like, all right, so now we're going to focus on Sickles is ordered to give up the high ground at Hazel Grove. And so getting to dig into that. All right. And then another decision is that generals and medical staff do not take Hooker out of command after he's suffered an injury. Like, what's that? And so getting to explore different stories happening in the Chancellorsville Crossroad clearing, not at exactly the same time, but within the same few hours, was really fascinating. And like getting to point a camera lens, if you will, where we need to look, because that's the focus of the critical decision. And, writing about Hooker and his injury, that's a chance to, without running off on a tangent, we could bring in Jonathan Letterman and a quick mention of, his role as a medical director. What does that include? Would he have been someone to make a critical decision? If so, why doesn't he? So, kind of bringing in different characters, and it almost became, it's not fiction, but it was almost like getting to write fiction, even while you have all your sources stacked up beside you. It's just this high drama and getting to focus on narrow slivers of it to build the case, to build out the options, to explain the decision and its result. I loved the writing process once I got into it.
Well, and you are someone who likes to tell stories. I mean, you're just
Yes.
a wonderful storyteller as a writer. And I found with my own experience writing it for the series is that like I still wanted to take that narrative approach, and even though I wasn't doing a sweeping narrative of the battle, and neither did you, like I still wanted to tell stories as opposed to just sort of do these little analyses, which a lot of the books in the series kind of just take that very factual analytical approach, and it works real well in a lot of instances. But like I know that's not quite your style, So how did you kind of come to grips with that, and how did you manage that?
Right. So I think just keeping a tight focus in my thinking and then in my writing. And the beauty of writing is you get to edit. So that's always a good thing. But keeping the tight focus on the critical decision. But as I was thinking about how can I write this book so hopefully it's engaging to read and we can add a little color to what might be really dry. And I looked at how you used more of a narrative form in yours, and I like your I like your Fredericksburg book a lot for that. But I knew that wasn't exactly the style I wanted to go for. I wanted to um, we have the person making the decision, but there's other people around him in these moments, or who will be affected by his decision and may never even know the general other than by name or by sight. So, what I did with the decisions was I would pick a quote or a soldier or some person involved in the moment and sort of open up with that because you get a little time to introduce the setting, and then I would try to bring that person back or what happened to them in the results. even if they're not exactly the end of the result, but giving them a little word in there. So kind of this full circle
Mhm.
in writing, which is something that I really enjoy writing that way. It was a writing skill that I use lots of times, and I would like to think I got to perfect a little bit when writing on the ECW blog over the years. So to then kind of take that idea, and I was still trying it out in blog posts at the time, but to take that idea and go, all right, I need my decision to be around 2,000 words. Think of it like a short article, think of it like a blog post. Yes, it has to fit into everything else and hopefully make sense, but this is the focus right now. And how do we bring it together so that if you just pick up the book and you go, I was watching Gods and Generals recently. I want to read the decision about Jackson. Jackson wants to go to War of the Fords. I want you to be able to read that and go, oh, I understand that decision. I may not have a glimpse of all the decisions that have been identified in this book for the battle or a good grasp of the whole battle itself, but I feel really comfortable and satisfied with what I read about that decision. I want it to have a beginning, the middle, and then a nice end. And for me, having similar voices or a story woven in, that kind of makes the bow on the package or the icing on the cake. So, using our example of Jackson and the Ford, the human interest, if you will, the full circle story that underlies the decision is James Keith Boswell. He's one of Jackson's staff officers, and he is killed in the friendly fire volley. And it has not sat well with me for a number of years that we've forgotten the other men who were wounded or killed in that friendly fire volley because Jackson gets all the attention because he's the lieutenant general. And I understand why we do that. But James Keith Boswell lost his life that night too. So weaving in his story, and obviously then we put the focus on Jackson and his decisions. But when we come back to the result, here's the result of what happened to Jackson, but here's also the result of what happens to some others in that scouting party as well.
Well, it's a kind of a neat way too to just kind of remind us about the humanity that's involved as well. Like keeping that focus on people, I think is
Right?
really important. So
Yeah.
where? Oh, I'm sorry. Where do you start your decisions? Like what's the first big decision?
Oh, the first ones. So we actually start in the winter of 1863. So the very first one is Lincoln appoints Hooker. So we get into the backstabbing and the blaming and all of that that's going on in the Army of the Potomac because I think, and I'd be curious to see what you think about this, Chris, but I think if we don't look at the climate, if you will, in the leadership of the Army of the Potomac, it's hard to understand some of the decisions, some of the paralyzing that happens as the Chancellorsville campaign unfolds. Some of it's personalities, for sure. John Sedgwick is not known for moving especially fast to begin with. But if you're afraid that you could get backstabbed because you make a decision that's unpopular, or a decision that in the moment looks like it should carry through, but then it turns out it doesn't, is anyone going to hear, well, this is the reason I did it, when you've just come out of Fredericksburg and everything that's happened with that? So, wanted to lay the groundwork kind of for the Army of the Potomac and Hooker there. And then the second decision picks up the Confederates, and that is Lee sends Longstreet's corps away. So that's sending away thousands of soldiers. It's difficult to feed them and their horses in the winter of 62, 63 in central Virginia. But that's going to have a big impact on Chancellorsville because Longstreet's not going to come back in time for that.
So, and it's interesting, starting with Lincoln appoints Hooker, which of course is a
Mhm.
huge thing. And you could kind of back that up and like Burnside decides to resign because, he doesn't get
Right.
fired. He still has his job, but he makes that decision to get fired. You don't start there. I'm putting you on the spot asking you this. Um,
Sure.
what's the difference between Burnside decides to resign or Lincoln decides to appoint Hooker?
If I remember right, we kind of went back and forth with this, and maybe it was in some of our discussions or discussions with the editors, like who is the person doing the action? When we think Is this active voice? Is this passive voice? And yes, it is active that Burnside decides to resign. It is active that Lincoln decides to appoint Hooker. Um, but looking at it historically, it seems to me that Lincoln is has to make a big critical decision. Is he going to step in and put someone in command who's also been threatening that maybe a dictatorship would be kind of cool? And that could be seen as a risk to Lincoln and his administration. And so I see Lincoln as sort of having to step in the moment, because even if Burnside resigns, that's a decision. But is it the critical decision? Because you still have to fill that leadership post. So trying to raise it to the highest level, make it the turning point moment. Once Hooker's appointed, there's no turning back right there. Burnside resigns. It's a personal critical decision. And this was something I struggled with because I love looking at personal critical decisions. But in the big scheme, someone's going to step in there. So we got to go to the next higher level. And I think one thing that stood out for me is looking at the letter that Lincoln writes to Hooker, and it's the "Go forth and give us victories" letter. And I think I read it as Lincoln's trying to instill some confidence in Hooker. He is laying out, we need a victory. And this is one of the things that makes Chancellorsville so fascinating to me at the higher strategic level when we're looking broad Civil War, is both the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia are trying to destroy each other. And Chancellorsville is a moment where that's going to attempt to happen. Somebody stalls out in the Virginia wilderness around the Chancellorsville headquarters, and then somebody has to keep dividing his army, so is reducing his fighting power force. And so it's not going to be that big army crushing victory that both sides are looking for. And about a year later, we're going to find the Army of Northern Virginia, the Army of the Potomac, back in the Virginia wilderness, this time Lee and Grant fighting the Overland Campaign, still trying to destroy or grind down the opponent's army.
And as you talk about this too, it's sort of, it's a good reminder that in the moment of these decisions, nothing is inevitable. Like we know what happens because we're 160 years in the future, but in the
Right?
moment, as you're kind of thinking these through, but it also sort of skirts that realm of counterfactuals. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if Burnside doesn't resign, we don't know what the answer of that is, right? So, like,
Right?
there's only so much you can explore if you're in that moment and kind of thinking it through. So, yeah, I kind of like the way that you say, like, all right, we got to look at what's the next thing that we do know, and how can we look at that moment and kind of parse that out. Um, do you think that Lincoln was a good decision maker based on how you had to approach it? That's a big question, isn't it? Is he a good decision maker?
For that decision, or are we like talking
Just
really
in
broad about
general, I
Lincoln's
suppose,
decision?
because I'm sure you've looked at him as a leader throughout this campaign because of this book, and just in general, you've had a lot of experience looking at Lincoln's leadership. What do you think?
So the quick, I'm not going to overthink it too much answer for both Chancellorsville and broadly in Lincoln's decisions is Lincoln, I see him as very calculating in his decisions. He recognizes that Joseph Hooker's caused some problems in post Fredericksburg. He's raised his own complaints about Burnside. He's gone against Burnside. Like, that's not super helpful if you're a subordinate commander. That's not very loyal. But, and I think Lincoln's pragmatic enough to see that. But Hooker also has shown a fighting streak in 1862. When you look at what he did on the peninsula, you look at Antietam, you look at Fredericksburg. Hooker can fight, and he's been rising up through the ranks. And I think looking at the slate of options and getting, and I do break them down, what are Lincoln's options in the moment, and what's a viable option. I probably overuse the word viable in my thinking and writing in some parts of the book, but that was the way I would think of it. Like, because you could go, well, Lincoln could put his son Tad in command of the army, but that's not a viable
Right.
option. That's running into the fiction club very much. So, what are his options in the reality of the moment as we can understand it through the sourcing? So Lincoln, I think, realizes he's taking a gamble with Hooker. He's stepping out against some of the advisors around him in his political circle, but he's looking for a victory. And I think he's willing to risk the impetuosity, the big words that Hooker has been using, and we need a victory, and that's what Lincoln's looking for. And to paraphrase his quote, you basically have to win victories before you can try to be a dictator in this case. So go win some victories, and then I'll worry about if he's going to come for my job and what that could look like. So I think Lincoln makes decisions um, in the moment. And I don't mean that he doesn't think about it, but he's going to try to get what he needs at that time. And he may make another decision later down the road. I think we see this in his approach to what do you do about the abolition, the emancipation of slaves. If he tries to do that in 1861, it's disastrous politically for him. By 1862, things are still on a wire politically, but he's now found a way that it can tie into some of the war aims and bring about a weakening for the Confederate forces. So I think we see Lincoln make different decisions at different times in very calculating ways.
I really like that idea of that word calculating for him. Now, when you talk about, he's thinking about what's at risk, and you mentioned that with Jackson and Lee earlier, what's at risk. And one of the things I kind of like about the decisions format is that you really do have to kind of think, like, what are the stakes in this moment? So, what can you win? What can you lose? And, I think that helps maybe frame this idea of like what's critical or not. And so maybe going back to Jackson, I'm going to decide to go on a reconnaissance. Well, you don't really know the stakes in that moment, but like, I'm going to cut these guys off from the ford. Well, suddenly the stakes are a lot different. Um,
Right.
as you looked at the stakes involved with the various decisions you looked at, did you learn anything new, or did an epiphany about a moment that suddenly like, oh my gosh, I didn't quite realize this before I thought about it?
I think so. I think there's two that I'll mention here. Certainly, you could explore lots of different moments, but I think one that really stood out is where Lee has to send Anderson and McLaws toward Salem Church, realizing how many times he's divided his army. And yes, I've read about it in other books. I've looked at it, but to actually sit there with it, sitting at my dining table, candle burning, it's I don't know what time in the morning, and just thinking, like, looking at the numbers and going, he's gonna divide again. And like we have the hindsight of knowing what happens, but looking at here's what, to the best of our knowledge, the information Lee has in that moment. This is what he knows about the scenario. These are options that would be viable. Um, what do you do? And to realize he's divided the army again. And I think sometimes, and I know this speaks to some of your writing and research, Chris, it can be easy to think Chancellorsville sort of peters off after Jackson's wounding. May 3rd is the day. And I've heard you say it, I've heard other historians say it as well. So I'm not bringing a brand new revelation here or anything. But I think it's also really easy to focus on the attack on the lines at Chancellorsville itself. And then you have to realize Lee has to divide the army again because Union troops have taken Marie's Heights. They're heading in. If they make that march swiftly, they're coming in on Lee's rear. Divide the army again, send more troops to Salem Church Ridge, and fight, hopefully for a victory, but at least for delaying time. Fight for time to be able to push Hooker back. It's like this game of, it's almost like, someone should do a meme of this. Maybe they already have, but in Jurassic World, where the main character is like holding off the velociraptors. It's kind of like you can picture Lee doing
Yeah.
that. Stay there, Hooker. Stay there, Sedgwick. Don't, he's holding them off. Maybe that's trivializing a little too much, but you can kind of see it in that. And one other that I'll point out that really I wasn't sure about it. I think you may have actually been the one who said go look at it a little bit. But when Hooker brings Hunt back, so Henry Hunt is supposed to be chief of artillery. He's gone through this whole leadership challenge with Hooker. And basically, Hooker has him sitting sort of babysitting cannons that aren't doing anything, which is not where you want Henry Hunt. When you look at Hunt's actions at Antietam, at Gettysburg, when he's able to work with reserve artillery and the logistics of artillery, it's very masterful. And getting to sort of dig into what hasn't gone right up to the afternoon evening of May 3rd, 1863, with Union artillery, and what's going to have Hooker make the decision to bring Hunt up into an active role. And there's a really fantastic quote coming from a primary source. And there's this artillery officer who comes to Hooker and like he's trying to report on what's going on, or Hooker wants him to. And the artillery officer just keeps asking, where is General Hunt? Where is General Hunt? That's the only thing this guy keeps saying because the artillery is so messed up. And you have infantry guys telling artillerymen what to do, and the infantry guys don't know what they're doing with artillery. And it's just been this whole debacle. Plus, you've got the Union Army retreating back to what we now call Hooker's last line. So it's just this whole mess. And this guy is so descriptive. And I put the quote in the book because it gives us the setup. Where is General Hunt? Where is General Hunt? Just asking over and over until Hooker starts to get the idea. Maybe he messed up in not having Hunt more active with the artillery before. So that was a new piece for me. And I did end up deciding it was a critical decision. I played with it for a while. It was on the chopping block. I wasn't sure, but then realized, yep, it is.
Yeah, I would back that up entirely because, of course, without the artillery support, the federal infantry collapses. And gosh, if there had been something else going on there, so it's has unexpected ramifications as a result.
Yep.
Um, what do you think was the most unexpected decision for you
Mm.
that you came up with?
I'm going to steal a look at the list
That's
here.
good. That's good. That's right.
All right. Unexpected. I don't know. I think one that really comes up as unexpected and that might surprise people on the list, and I alluded to it before, is Union officers do not replace Hooker after his injury.
Big one.
We can
Big
focus
one.
so much on who made the decision to send a flank march, who decided to divide the army, who decided to stop at the Chancellorsville clearing, and dig trenches. Those are big decisions, but I think those are ones that are going to check the boxes. People are going to go, "Oh yeah, that's big." But digging in on bringing Hunt from the rear and then deciding not to replace Hooker after his injury. And that was a really interesting one to write because it's a decision not to do something. Many other decisions are a decision to go do something or go try to do something. And this one, the decision is actually we're not going to do anything. And getting to explore how are the politics at play in the Army of the Potomac? What would it look like? Who would be up next? Ooh, maybe we don't want to deal with him in the midst of the retreat of the army. So there's a lot going on. And then, but to see Meade and a few of the other generals sort of step in and cover at headquarters for Hooker. Like when he's able to make, decisions and be riding, and we have accounts of that, he's doing that. But then when he needs to lay down because his head is hurting so bad or he's not in good physical shape, the others are covering for him. And it's very interesting that because I would argue there's grounds that he could have been temporarily removed for medical condition, but that Letterman doesn't do that. The staff and the generals around him don't insist upon that. It's really fascinating to see how it plays out. And it's also drawing corps commanders Fifth Corps, Second Corps commanders away from their commands, which have now forced division commanders to step up. And now we've just totally altered the Union's chain of command in a few places, right as some howling brigades of Confederates are starting to converge in on the Chancellorsville crossroads. So it's a moment that hinges like crazy.
And you think too, like Hooker's decision not to turn over command,
Yes,
and
that was
like
one of the options.
is he even in a mental state to make that decision or not? And so
Right.
so yeah, I mean it's a fraught moment for sure, with a lot of Confederate pressure pushing in, as you point out.
And like
How
being
you know?
like
No, go ahead.
being careful not to, over speculate the extent of his injury. Like we can really only go with here's what eyewitnesses are telling us. Yeah, I feel like it's a safe speculation if we look at his later medical history in his life. Maybe there's some effects there. You might be able to draw some lines, but we can't diagnose someone 160 years later. So we just kind of have to go with what the sources tell us. But then I think it is raise the question of what's going on with the rest of his health. The stories will fly back and forth, but Hooker says he stopped drinking going into the Chancellorsville campaign. There were some generals around him who said the same thing. Now there's some others who say, "Oh no, he was drunk." So hard to tell. Of course, there's political motivation to those stories coming from both sides as well. But if we choose to believe him, and if he really had stopped drinking, is he going through intense withdrawals? What's that doing to his physical state even before he gets probably concussed, but at least suffers a head injury.
Oh,
Um,
my head is so woozy, I can't ever write a battle report for the battle ever again. That's
right. That's also
because he,
convenient.
yeah, how can we? Because he doesn't leave his account of what actually happens.
Yeah.
So, what is the last decision? We talked about what's the first one. What's the last one?
Yeah. So the last decision is Hooker retreats.
Okay. All right.
So, and some of the decisions that got chopped had to do with beyond the retreat across the Rappahannock. But the editors, and I think rightfully, advised that those decisions were probably better for the lead up into the Gettysburg campaign,
Yeah.
with some of the reorganizing of the army that happens and things like that. So Hooker retreats, but looking at his Council of War
Hmm.
and who says what. And you had a lot of Union generals who were willing to stay and fight, to stay on the south side of the Rappahannock and continue to fight it out, or try to unite with Sedgwick, or Sedgwick come over. Like there's quite a few options there. And Hooker decides, nope, we're going back across the river.
Yeah.
And that led into some of the concluding points, and we won't give away all of them. Um, but thinking about how that affects, particularly the Army of the Potomac, ahead of what we now call the Gettysburg campaign. You have some soldiers who are really angry. You have regiments of soldiers that are frustratedly angry. And it was fascinating to survey through a lot of letters and see where the soldiers place blame for the battle. It's not as frequently on Hooker as we might initially think. Um, it can go on the Sixth Corps. It can go on the 11th Corps. It's never the Corps you're in, because human nature doesn't work that way. So the 11th Corps is going to blame the Sixth Corps and vice versa. But and I'm generalizing a little bit here. But there are some lines that really stood out and common themes with the frustration of the soldiers in the Union Army, that they wanted a fair fight in open ground. Those become words that stand out, themes that stand out in their writing. And you think about, with hindsight of history, if you stand on Cemetery Ridge, that's open ground.
Yeah.
They got to fight, and the Union Army is going to stand in that fight. And I think one of the what ifs that the dangerous what if, is what if that Council of War at Gettysburg that Meade calls, what if the generals say, no, we need to retreat?
Hmm.
What does the army do? I think ultimately the soldiers will obey commands. I don't think there'd be a mass mutiny, but think about, it's another repeat of falling back from Chancellorsville.
Right, right. Yeah,
because
definitely that Council of War at Chancellorsville, I think informs that Council of War at Gettysburg for sure.
yes, yes. And this comes back to, and I know we've talked about this at symposiums, sitting around just talking history, and I mention it frequently on, tours and American Battlefield Trust videos. We need to make sure we don't silo our battles. It can be really easy to go, I've read a book on Chancellorsville. I visited Chancellorsville Battlefield. I've read a book on Gettysburg. I visited Gettysburg Battlefield. They're connected. If a general, if a soldier has fought at one and then fights at the next, what's the experience? What are some similarities? Did he write about those similarities? What does it look like? So keeping, the argument's been made, and I write about it a bit in the conclusion. When Sickles is told to give up the high ground at Hazel Grove and then sees that we just handed a huge artillery platform to the Confederates and my corps got bombarded for a few hours, when you realize that and then stand and look and go, well, yeah, the Peach Orchard at Gettysburg is technically terrain wise higher ground. Now, I'm not here to excuse Sickles from disregarding orders or advice. I still would have a bone to pick with him over that. But I think when we go, yeah, think about what happened at Chancellorsville, you start to read terrain differently, battlefield to battlefield. And I think that's one of the ways that preservation is so helpful, because we can read the battle reports, but this weekend I'm getting ready to go to Antietam, and it's like you go to Antietam and you look at something there, and then you come look at Fredericksburg, and then you go look at the battlefield at Chancellorsville, and if you're following a brigade or a general or a regiment, you start to see some things and you start to realize what these men are learning under fire and how that's going to inform the critical decision, the personal one, the regiment one, the big command one, battle to battle to battle in those dominoes, like you were talking about.
One of the things, and this is not a criticism of the book, maybe, when your editor said like some of these decisions are maybe for a pre-Gettysburg campaign thing. Um, one decision I think that's really important is Lincoln's decision to keep Hooker in command after the battle.
Yes, that was
Um,
one that
yeah,
got chopped.
and that often gets sort of forgotten or lumped into that pre-Gettysburg stuff. But I do think it contextualizes Chancellorsville in a really important way because like Hooker doesn't get fired. A lot of people forget like he doesn't get fired as a result of this, and kind of keeping that in mind, I think puts that campaign into a slightly different context for folks. So, who do you think gets the best marks as a decision maker in the campaign based on your work on this book?
I know it's cliche, but Lee makes some impressive decisions. He takes some huge risks, which we might say something really differently if they hadn't worked out in his favor. But he looks at the situation and makes decisions based on the information he has at that time. And I think one of them that really stood out to me is where there's Union troops that have crossed near Fredericksburg. This is right, April's coming to an end, and something else is going on further to the west. Lee has to decide, is the threat at Fredericksburg, is the threat coming from the west? And he's going to make a decision to send Jackson and Corps out west toward Chancellorsville, to zone Church Ridge, although he doesn't quite know that's the spot at the time. Jackson will help determine that, along with other Confederates who had previously made a stand there. But it's one of those moments where I'm in my own personality, I'm not super fast about making a decision. I would be like, well, let me look at it a little longer. Let's get a little more information, and I would potentially in that scenario sit there a little too long. But Lee makes a decision with the information he has. Turns out to be a pretty accurate guess, and I think that's where we see Lee trying to have a sense of his opponent as well. So that's one that definitely stands out. And I think, Chancellorsville's pointed to as Lee's greatest victory. And yeah, it might be a little cliche, and maybe we're not focusing on always the moments of it. We see his victory moment in the Chancellorsville clearing, but maybe we need to relook at the decisions that got him to that moment.
Hmm.
But also being really cognizant of Lee's not happy after Chancellorsville.
Right.
So we can say Chancellorsville is Lee's greatest victory, but you have a very angry man in the final days of Chancellorsville and someone who's realizing we just fought a really costly battle in loss of life, and I didn't crush the Army of the Potomac. I'm not sitting in the Capitol, the federal Capitol. You know, okay, it's a big victory, but it's still in the end, Lee didn't get to his ultimate goal there. So I think it's kind of that double edged sword with Lee. He does
Yeah.
so many things and he gets the praise in the history books, but he himself is so frustrated.
I think he's an excellent calculated risk taker. You know, when he makes those
Yes.
decisions, he I mean he's weighing those pros and cons and making that quick
Mhm.
decision based on that information. I think you're absolutely right. You know, a decision that he makes that I think gets overlooked a lot of times is after the Federals escape at Banks's Ford after the fight at Salem
Yes.
Church, he decides he's going to go back and attack Hooker,
Yes.
and Hooker made that decision to withdraw across the river too. And I sort of wonder, like, if Lee decides to go back and attack Hooker, I don't know that that works out very well for Lee,
Nope.
but we don't ever get to find that out.
Right.
But I think there's an instance where, because he's as unhappy as you mentioned, and he's
Mhm.
really, disappointed at how things worked out, he's looking to try to find that smash. He's ready to still keep swinging. Yeah, I think maybe he dodged a bullet on that one.
Yep. And it's sorry, go ahead.
And we'll never know, obviously. It's getting to the counterfactual stuff.
Right. It is interesting though. I believe it's Edward Porter Alexander post-war has some really interesting things to say because he went and inspected the Union lines, what would be the last lines at Chancellorsville, that Lee wants to go and attack. And Alexander's like, we would have all been slaughtered. It's a mercy to us that they left, you know. And Alexander had made some comments about how upset Lee was, and so realizing Lee's upset, would he have ordered these attacks? Like this could have been a destruction of the Army of Northern Virginia on an even greater scale. So kind of interesting.
So as we get ready to wrap up, as if people pick up your book, obviously this isn't a beginning to end campaign history. What do you
Right.
hope folks are able to take away from it as a way to understand Chancellorsville?
So I hope that it is a good way to explore the concept of critical decisions. And I hope that it inspires readers to think of other critical decisions. So I've made my list of 16, and they were fascinating to research. I enjoyed the writing process. But I want readers to go, well, okay, I see that, but what about these? And play it out. Does it rise to the level of a critical decision? Does it hit somewhere else on the decisions chart, which is helpfully included in, I think it's the introduction of the book. What would your list of critical decisions be? You know, I've read quite a few of the books in the Command Decisions in America's Civil War by University of Tennessee Press, and a number of the decisions in different battle books, I'm like, yep, 100% agree. But I'll be honest, there's some where I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that one. And it's not to throw shade at the authors. And I would hope that, if we ever met those authors and by mutual agreement we wanted to talk about it, we could kind of politely argue it. That's something that I think is really important in history dialogue. You know, different people bring different perspectives. We can look at the primary sources, we can look at battlefield terrain, we can look at all the pieces, and someone's going to see something different. And it doesn't mean that everyone has to agree with them, but let's hear them out. And maybe it will influence our thinking, and it might even be that your position just gets a little stronger in the argument or the defense. Or maybe you see the other person's perspective or a new source you didn't know about before, and oh, wow, this is going to shift my interpretation. So, and that certainly happened for me over the years. You think back, or I think back to being a teen and coming to Chancellorsville for the first time and being horribly confused by all the roads and just wanted to know Jackson's story, to then I remember the first time I picked up the book that you and Chris White wrote on Second Fredericksburg and Salem Church and going, oh wow, there's a lot more happening here. And then, just the years go on and we keep reading, we keep learning, and hopefully we keep talking and exploring ideas. And I hope that's what people take away. See if you like it. See if you like the decisions. What other decisions would you put forward? And how does this further, hopefully, good scholarship and good discussions about Chancellorsville?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. When I wrote the Fredericksburg book, I've written about Fredericksburg a lot. And so
Right.
using this format to write about it helped me see a battle and a battlefield I knew really well in a different way. And, so to me, that was a neat gift that I got from the writing process of that book. And I think your book offers that same sort of gift to readers where, like, oh, yeah, I think I know Chancellorsville, but here's kind of another way to look at it with a different lens that I think people are really going to take away some interesting thoughts because of your study. So,
Thank you.
yeah. So, Sarah, it's so nice to have you back on the podcast. Thanks for being with us.
Yes. Thanks for the invitation.
So, the book is Decisions at Chancellorsville by Sarah Kay Bierle, part of the Command Decisions in the Civil War and University of Tennessee
A little
Press. Oh,
blur.
it's a little blurry. I'll make sure we get a picture of it posted on the website for
Thank
us.
you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm Chris Mikowski for Sarah Kay Bierle. Thanks for being with us here on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.